What's going on, everybody, and welcome into the 111th episode of the Crazy One podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates. Now, as you probably saw from the title, this is a return to the Share the Mic Now episodes. And maybe you remember, maybe you didn't, but I said a while ago that these episodes are now a permanent part of the show. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because I felt like the problems that we are facing, the discussions we want to have, the things that people need to hear are not going to go away. Now, whenever I said that a few months ago, I don't think even I could have imagined the events that could have transpired over the last weeks and months that I feel like have so underlined and highlighted that thought remains very relevant. And so as I looked at when I wanted to bring the show back for 2021, really looking at the calendar and seeing that, the ability to be able to release it on a week that held both Martin Luther King Day and an inauguration day of a new administration felt like the right week to be able to do it. Now, this episode in particular is the first of two episodes that were created by Antionette Carroll. She's the founder and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab. But this first of the two episodes is called Dismantling White Supremacy in Design. Now, the only thing I want to say about this episode is for those of you who read or hear words like white supremacy and think, you know what? This episode isn't for me. This isn't something I need to listen to. I'm not a part of the problem. You're wrong. This episode is something that I think everybody needs to listen to. You need to listen to what is talked about. You need to listen to the emotional spectrum of the conversation that runs from laughter to tears. Because I think too often what we do, too often even what I've been guilty of, is whenever you hear words like white supremacy, what we do is that we associate that with the extremist behavior, something you would see like an organization like the KKK or the Proud Boys, which is true. But what's also happening there is what we are doing is we're compartmentalizing and saying, well, since we aren't, exhibiting behavior that's that extreme, we're not a part of the problem. I think that this conversation does an amazing job of highlighting the spectrum of the problem, of giving you a real understanding into what is going on. And what Antionette is that in this episode she has a conversation with two different gentlemen, David Clifford, who is the founder of Design School X and Liberatory Design, and Timothy Barlevins, who is the co-founder of And Design and a product design manager at Facebook. Like I said, I think this is a profoundly and extremely important conversation to everybody to listen to. So I'm incredibly humbled to start off the year and to be able to introduce Antionette Carroll.
Hello, everyone. My name is Antionette Carroll, and I am the founder, president, and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab. I am a mother. I am a practicing designer, actually practicing graphic design. I am a social entrepreneur, and I am a Black woman. And I am extremely proud to be here today on the Crazy One podcast, talking with David Clifford and Timothy Barlevins about how we can, one, not only acknowledge, but also dismantle white supremacy in design. So Tim and David, how are you?
Doing well.
I'm awesome.
So let's introduce you all to everyone that's listening. So let's start with you, David. Can you tell people who you are and why you are here?
Oh, yeah. So I am a father of two teenage daughters. I am a husband. I'm a craftsman, a trained jeweler and metalsmith. I identify as an equity designer and a design ally. I am a co-founder of DSX, Design School X. I'm a co-creator of Liberatory Design. And I am here because I don't really have a choice in this work, I believe. As an upper middle class, straight white man, the beneficiary of generations of systemically designed oppression, my white men are the reason for the oppressive season. I don't even know what to say. I'm leveraging all of that power and privilege to actually try to redesign white men.
I love it. And honestly, when you say systemically designed oppression, we're going to dive deeper into that a little bit more soon. But let's hear it from Tim. Can you tell us who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, by the way, that was a beautiful phrase. I'm taking that. I am a gay Black man from the South. I'm a designer, a design leader, a mentor, a co-founder. I am a pet parent because everyone's parents except me. Apparently, it's not great, and all the things. I don't know. Yeah, like I lead product design team specifically in tech. I work for Facebook currently, co-founder of the and design company with our host Antionette Carroll, and with that, we've been doing a ton of work specifically around Black, Latinx, and Indigenous creatives. And outside of that, like, why am I here? Because I am the best in the worst form of chaotic good. I'm a true believer in setting everything on fire and rebuilding it from the ground up. And I am a provocateur. Even at work, I tell people my job is two things: to be a provocateur and to not get fired. And I do both of those things pretty well.
I don't know, corporate world. I mean, commending you, the fact that you were surviving in corporate.
I love it.
I'm an HR nightmare. I am, but so far it's been really good. And if I ever got fired, I'd just tell people, like, just so you know, I'm gonna go to the media and I'm gonna say it's because I'm Black. So just be prepared.
Of course you are. Of course you are. So chaotic good. I want t-shirts that say that. I want enamel pins. Like, this is a brand in itself.
Yes.
So good.
That is who I am through and through. Mm-hmm.
I love it. And so, David, you talked about systemically designed oppression. And it's interesting because, as you know, in my work, I talk about how systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design, but that also means that they can be redesigned. Mm-hmm. I would love for you all to let's go to the basics. Let's shatter and challenge the idea of what design means. So tell me what comes to mind for you when you think of design.
I mean, I feel like we're going to end up reiterating each other quite a bit, but it's everything, right? Like, everything that we think about that I think is within our power to control as design, even things that are out of our control of design, if you really want to think about the design of the world, right? Like, things are created to live off of, thrive from, and sort of benefit from each other in one way, shape, or form or another. When we think about design, I've seen, let's say, design through the lens of man as it relates to the sort of visual output or expression that we have sort of come to believe it to be today. I think design has sort of been pigeonholed a lot. First, it was like design is brand or logos or marketing or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then, especially these days, design is tech and product design, and apps and things. But really and truly, I tell people as a leader, a design leader, I'm not in Sketch or Figma or anything like that anymore. I'm designing organizations. I'm designing engagement models. I'm designing how people navigate spaces to do their best work. And so in that, it's all encompassing. It is the umbrella for everything in which we create, for both knowingly and unknowingly. So that's my quick definition.
Mm-hmm. What about you, David?
I see what comes up for me about design is that everything is designed and that all of us are designers, whether we know it or not. And in fact, I think we come out into this world as creative and as designers. And I think schools intentionally design that out of us by design. Because there's really nothing more dangerous to white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy than to have a community that is creative and equity or community driven. Oriented. Design also for me is that we're always designing. We're designing, and Timothy brought this up, graphics, objects, products. We're designing spaces. We're designing processes and systems. Then design our mindsets and can impact our values, and our values impact our actions and how we spend our money, how we spend our time, etc. And it's super pervasive. So the goal is really to, I think, if we're all designers, to be really conscious of how we are designers and conscious of our actions.
This is going to be church today. I see already. Okay. All right. I'm prepared. I'm ready for this.
Exactly. There's a few things you both brought up. I think it's great. Like, Tim, when you were talking, the question I immediately thought of is, what are you designing, right? Like, you talked about designing organizations. And I know myself, I'm always thinking about, how am I designing a movement around equity design and liberation and justice and youth power and leadership? You know, David, you talked about designing mindsets, right? And the idea that we need to have a mindset shift. And how does that show up in values? How does that show up in our purpose? And also, how has that shown up in our history, right? Because when we think about the systems in which we're navigating and the world in which we're really trying to live, but not just live, but also thrive, it is a lot of things that were pre-established by someone else's values, by someone else's design. And those values, in many cases, excluded me as a Black woman. They were the ones that told me that I wasn't good enough, or I had a specific role that I was supposed to play. And some people, unfortunately, are still upholding that. And so when we think about the idea of white supremacy, what do you think of? Like, what is the design of white supremacy? How do you even define white supremacy, especially when it comes to dismantling it? How has it showed up in your life, in your work, whether it's to the tangible or also to the like massive systemic things that are in many cases invisible, that we are not even aware that we are wading through that water and having to unlearn that in all of our work?
David, I'm gonna let you go first. And I say that both to break the silence and because I need to absorb all of this.
Okay, I'll take it. So the question is, what is white supremacy to me or us? The way I've been thinking about it lately is under this umbrella called white dominant culture, or it's a Venn. And anyhow, there's a Venn. And white dominant culture is like a BFF, so best friends forever, between white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And I would also add Christianity, not in its origins, but how it has been co-opted by white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. And so I think all four of those together is the air and the water that we breathe, especially in this country, because that's the foundation of this country. And I, because my work in particular is in designing the whiteness out of design. And part of that is having a laser focus on white men. I know, because from my own experience as a white dude, and then also working with white men, that it's super duper hard to notice white dominant culture because it is the water that has been designed for us to swim in. So it's particularly invisible. And so how do I design learning experiences and curriculum to coax out courage and curiosity? Because I think those are really the only two ingredients. Well, and white male fragility. Those are the ingredients that I believe I have to work with in redesigning white men and white dominant culture mindsets and habits.
It's funny, like this water sort of metaphor is like, it's funny because I remember when I wrote the article around the white supremacist culture of AIGA, and I found this perfect graphic, which was like a fish in water. It's like, a fish in the water doesn't know it's wet, right?
Yep.
But you perpetuate all these systems and you do all this stuff, but you're like, oh, well, no, that's just like normal. No, I worked hard. I put up my bootstraps and, I went in and, worked hard. One thing I've been really pushing on more is getting people to understand that white supremacy isn't only expressed or permeated by white people.
Come on, say it again for the people in the back.
Because and this is especially, I mean, I will say it's especially true across a lot of things, but in tech, many times it's very true, especially Asian men. They do this a ton. They have learned and developed from their white male counterparts, and then they then in turn reflect that back and do the same things and create the same like sort of systems. So there's a really great, she's like an equity trainer or whatever. Her name is Paku Her. And she has this training called the Borderlands training. And it talks about there's centers of power, and there are people who live on the borderlands. And many times you never really understand what your center of power is and how you're putting others on the borderland. But it's like all that is really a reflection of, or a sort of remnant of white supremacy, of like there is power that exists and you are being dictated towards like how you have to operate within that structure of power. How do you show up? Can you show up, et cetera, right? And the ways I've talked about like whiteness and product design has been both in like how we do work, how we do research, things like that, but also like, you know, in companies these days, it's like, hey, bring your whole self to work. Whoever you are, just bring them to work. But we all know, like, as a white person, you can do that. But if I'm a Black gay man from the South who's coming into work, and let's say I love cussing and rap music, that don't mean I can just bring my whole self to work and that be like, I'm going to make someone feel uncomfortable. Someone's going to feel like, oh, I'm being too aggressive or whatever the case may be. So while you're able to bring your whole self to work within this, you know, this system of whiteness, I can only bring a part of myself that you find to be acceptable to your whiteness into this space. And so like, I think, you know, to David's point around like, is this like white dominant cultures, like understanding that white supremacy is also the rejection of otherness and others, and anything that sort of comes through and threatens that dominant culture is automatically going to be sort of pushed out, rejected, or sort of beaten down to a point where it either like concedes and folds in, or it leaves.
Yeah, I will say it's interesting because, you know, I sometimes joke with you that I could never live in or survive in corporate. Like I would be fired on the second day. And that's because the first day was focused on like paperwork. And so the second day is when I opened my mouth and they were like, okay, yeah, no, you can't be here. Even when I think about, for instance, how you're saying others perpetuate the harm of the supremacy mindsets and white supremacy culture, and honestly creating the space of othering versus a space of belonging and liberation, it also makes me think about the fact that we have been forced to code switch or conform so many times that we have, in many cases, in trying to survive, have upheld the system of oppression unintentionally.
Yes.
And so when I think of design as the intent and unintentional impact behind an outcome. And by trying to survive through conformity, that unintentionally has said that this system is okay. And it has led to particularly white folks that have been in more privileged positions, whether we're talking about along the lens of whiteness, and if you intersect that with actual ability status, intersect that with, as David pointed, like religious centering, right? Because most of the time we're talking about holidays that are through Christian and not, like we said, not the foundation of Christianity, but how Christianity is being portrayed in the United States context. When you intersect that with classism, you know, et cetera. Politics, right?
Like even liberal politics, the amount of whiteness in liberal politics.
The liberal moderate, the liberal moderate, right? What happens is that we are navigating our trauma by creating more trauma. And it's like when you hear people say hurt people. And so I have been, in some cases, and in some spaces, been viewed as this unique unicorn because I refuse to wear a mask. I refuse to sit there and play this game of conformity. Because years ago, I made the decision that I'm okay with whatever consequences come my way, whether it's positive or negative. There's times in which I have cried in bathrooms because I've been treated a certain way because I was viewed as the angry Black woman. And then there's times in which I've been in someone's face and been like, I honestly don't care that you have this belief that many times has been built around a history of erasure and a history of genocide, and that I am not going to sit in silence and allow you to define what my beliefs are because it makes you feel comfortable. right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about as designers, and we could talk about traditional designers, or we could talk about designers and the reality that we are all everyday designers. Like David, you talk about being design allies and equity designer, which for me is all encompassing this idea of being a redesigner for justice, right? Like how and what do we as designers do to challenge white supremacy? And how do we also understand that it doesn't just show up as let me change something temporarily in a project and not really look at how do I build my own humility to actually become better, and not better through the lens of perfectionism, because perfectionism is a form of white supremacy. And when we talk about being normal, that is again centering white supremacy and white narratives. But really, how do we understand that unlearning and learning is a journey, that the work towards equity and liberation is messy, work towards being anti-racist is messy, and how do we as designers center the personal as well as the professional when we're challenging white supremacy?
If I could say a couple things, and it may or may not be sort of on topic with the answer, or the right kind of answer, whatever right is. Sure. Okay, so I'll talk from a product perspective coming in from tech, right? So I think many times what we do is like, when we think about, let's say, checking for bias, quote unquote, we think about it at the end of the process. We've thought through everything, we've done all the research, we're ready to ship, and we say, hey, have we checked for accessibility? Or, are we sure we haven't forgot about such and such person, or whatever the case may be, as opposed to when it's still an idea. We haven't done any research yet. We haven't dug into it. We haven't checked the market for it. This is still an idea. And at that point in which the inception of the idea has been created, we say, okay, cool. What are the things, the tools, the people we need to make sure that we're understanding this thing fully? And that could be, let's say for like a payments project, it could be like, hey, so from the jump, we don't need to think about the person who has 4G LTE network and, they don't have to worry about internet connection or things like that. Let's start from the person who has no internet, who will likely be in a spotty service, or they have a phone that's 10 years old or something like that sort of creates these mechanisms for barriers for their economic growth. And then start there and say, okay, cool. Now, how would this thing work? How would we do this thing? How would we build it? Because we're starting from a place of like that, like not from the place of what we call like 80-20 sort of thing. Like we're not starting from the 80% where almost everyone gets it. It's like, no, it's that 20% who probably is going to have the worst experience ever. And we got to think about them really deeply. In Capital One, when in banking, they call it disparate impact. So when you give a loan, you say, like, you have to think about disparate impact. So when you have these programs, and let's say, hey, we're going to give you X% off if you buy this home. Well, you need to be able to, that organization needs to be able to do the research to say, how would this disproportionately negatively impact, let's say, communities of color? So like Latinx folks or Black folks are historically underinvested, or, lower income folks, or whatever the case may be. And you have to actually go in and say, okay, cool. So how do we fix this program, make this program work specifically for them, knowing that it's going to have disparate impact if we don't? And that is something is like written in like compliance documents where the government is mandating that. But in design, especially in product, we don't have those same mandates. So what we do is we lean on this person had the best intent possible, but intent doesn't equate to the impact that it just had on these people. Like, and still into this day, Zoom has it set up so that if you are dark skinned, you cannot be seen if you add on an interactive background to this day. And they found this out months ago and they still haven't fixed this thing. Why? Because no one ever thought, oh, well, if someone's darker skinned, then how do we differentiate between a dark skin and a dark background? You know, like, and there are things like that happen all the time in tech. And it's because it's not even like something happened with Twitter and how the algorithm on Twitter prioritized white faces if you had an image that was too big. And one of the women who's she's like communication or PR person, whatever, she said, we're sorry about this. We checked this for bias, but, and we didn't find any bias. Well, who checked it for bias? A team full of white male engineers? Would they have known to say, hey, how does this interact with darker skin? And these things happen constantly all the time. And like skin, like when it comes to camera and skin tones, that should be like table stakes. Like that should be the first thing you think about is, how's this going to work across a myriad of skin tones? And then from there, what are the other things we have to think through? But like, I think for me, it sort of it's both like the people you hire, and all these other things. But many times I've seen a lot of frameworks when it comes to equity design or equitable processes that really are inclusive design that really starts like, well, you should ask the question, who are you leaving out? And all these other questions. Mm-hmm. But I think David probably understands probably more than anybody of like, if these people aren't trained to think about others, then when you ask them, who's being left out, they're gonna blame nobody. We get most people. Yeah. And they're not gonna see a problem in it, right? And so like, there is something fundamentally wrong with like, how we even think about others. And like you use the phrase, I know you've used in one of your talks, Antionette, around surely like humbling yourself and sort of like being able to like really step outside of yourself. There's something there that we just, for whatever reason, have leaned on individualism, which is of course the precept of white supremacy, and have forgotten about how do we step outside of ourselves to include and think about and really seek out others. And don't let me get started on like innovation. Because I think innovation, especially in tech, is one of the reasons why there's so much white supremacy now, because we want to do things behind closed doors, which means we're not bringing the right people in, we're not asking the right questions. And ultimately, we have these extremely harmful products that get shipped out into the world because we want it to be innovative and want it to be first to market.
And we want to be the ones recognized for it, not recognizing that there's also people on the ground more likely that has been doing this. And it is one of those paternalistic mindsets, which is another form of white supremacy, by the way, folks, where I'm going to come and help this community. I'm going to give them this. Like how many investments financially, time-wise, et cetera, have we put into products, programs, policy, curriculum, et cetera, that has continually harmed Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, like that's harmed communities of color because we were so focused on wanting to be the only or wanting to be the one that has the recognition throughout history. And what's interesting when I think about legacy, because I've been thinking about legacy a lot more the last few years since I lost my brother, it's never through the lens of, oh, I just want my name to be on a building, right? Like for me, it's recognizing that as a Black, particularly not just Black, but as an African-American woman in the United States, I do not know my own history. It has intentionally been erased. And so when I am thinking about legacy, I am honestly thinking about how do I make sure that my family down the line can look back and know that I was here and that they have a history, opposed to being told that their history is tied into the majority or the centered perspective that many times told them that they were less than and not enough.
So something you said earlier, just imagine if we change, like if we could all collectively change the phrase from design for to design with.
That's right.
And I honestly will say, for me, it's not even just designing with, but also how are we co-creators, and also who gets to have the decision-making power? Because there's times in which we are designing with, but we are bringing people still in as research subjects, or they're coming in as, let me give you this temporary insight towards the latter end of the project, versus me actually being invited as a diverse co-creator because I am the living expert of the issue. And therefore we need to be working together and bringing in not just academic and professional pedigree, but that living knowledge and understanding that that's just as powerful, if not more so. And so I want to make sure we provide space for David. Come on, David. Come on in.
There's so much. And I want to come back to the fish metaphor. But to your point, Antionette, how can we design the context where people who have traditionally been excluded from design, so anybody who's not white male, how do we design the context so that they can see themselves in the design process? That we're designing, in fact, the bat signals, if you will, that say that you belong here, that you are a designer in designing a more liberating world. Yep. And to the point of that you made, Tim, about the fish not knowing it's wet, right? White designers don't know that they have an illness. And the illness is the myth of a white America, or the myth of saviorism, or the myth of whiteness, or the water here is a cancer, and the cancer is systemic racism, right?
And the myth of this country being founded, right? Like there was already people here, just FYI. Believe me, if you also say you're an American, I just want to remind you that there are many different Americas. Just
that's right.
Says a FYI.
That's right. To your point too, Tim, about design, and I like to quote Ice Cube in we needing to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves when we're designing. And that was one of the reasons, or the catalytic moments of liberatory design. Is design thinking is cool and all, because you are asked to empathize with your users, right? However, if we, and again, from my perspective as a white male designer, if I'm not pausing to notice and reflect on my identities, my values, my emotions, my relationship to power, and my intentions, I will, and I've done it before, I will bake my very whiteness and my identity and my biases into even how I listen to folks. Right?
Come on.
And so if that was why we added notice and reflect to design thinking, to intentionally create a moment where, not just at the beginning, but throughout the human-centered design process, that we are constantly thinking about how we're showing up or how we're not, so that it doesn't become, as you pointed out, a checkbox to be checked with this, and this, but that we're constantly co-creating, we're constantly checking ourselves, and we're constantly reflecting on how white dominant habits are showing up in our decisions.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you said specifically around like the fact of even when you listen and process, you can still like apply your whiteness to it, because that's something that we've talked about quite a bit, is like, you can do the best research in the world, but if you still have people who are taking it and filtering it through their own thought processes, experiences, mindset, and then pushing out like, oh, this is what they mean, and they're not checking themselves back, especially with that community in which they found, like they learned this from, then you think you did due diligence because you did the research, but the processing of that information was still like tainted with your own perspective, and thus is no longer relevant.
Yeah, that was spot on. And so I want to flip it a bit, because I feel like there's a lot of times where when we're having these discussions around oppressive systems, we can tend to focus on negatives, right? Like we could tend to have this scarcity mindset of here's all the problems we have, and not really get to also the flip side of that, right? Like, how do we design and also think about the role of design when it comes to creating a society of liberation, a society of being restorative? What does that look like? How do we flip it to have more of this asset-based mindset and really think about, like, how do we create spaces of liberation? And what has that looked like for you in your own life? Of how have you created spaces of liberation for yourself, even at your home? It could be at work. What has that actually looked like for you?
I think for me, and I'll be honest and say, like, I don't think I've created enough spaces to know fully what that feels like, or have been in spaces that have been created for me enough to know what that feels like. But I'll talk from the perspective of me being a manager, because I think that's something where that's a space that I can create and sort of control in a culture that I'm forced to spearhead in some way, because otherwise, like, it can go left one way or the other, right? And as a manager, something that I've always prided myself is, one, leading with transparency, no matter what, right? Like, I think that there's so many organizations, they're like, even like politicians do this, like they don't see, especially in corporations, they do this. they don't see the people who work there as adults who are functioning, like alive, that have, as many times have, advanced degrees, who can probably process and understand things, right? They sort of like handle people with kitten gloves. They tell them half truths or part of the story, just enough to make them feel good, like to maintain quote unquote morale. It's like, but sometimes the best thing you can do for a person is to tell them the God honest truth and help them understand, like give them the space to process it and process with them, and to like connect in that way and make it a meaningful conversation. And like, hey, this is going to be a tough conversation, but let's understand and talk about like, what does this look like? What does this mean for you? Like, to me, the space in which I feel the best is when I know that I'm not being like basically lied to. Like I'm not like being treated as a child. I am being told that God honest truth, but also I know that my thoughts, opinions, emotions are both listened to, validated, and also appreciated and rewarded. And so like when I think about my team and the team that I always develop, it is based on that transparency where like everyone here has an opinion, everyone here has thoughts. Let's talk about it. We may not agree on it, and let's talk about what we don't agree about. And like it's not for us to have consensus. It's not meant for us to all be the same. Like I come at this space very different than you do. As a manager, I'm like, hey, you might really love documenting everything that we talk about. I am not a documenter. And so my ask is that you don't impose that on me. And I will make sure I make space to allow you to do what you need to do so that we both can navigate this space the best way we need to, so that when we get done with this, like whether it's me done being your manager or whatever the case may be, you have the tools you need. Because my job ultimately isn't to just manage you, it's to give you the tools you need to be successful internally or once you leave this company. Like I have a moral obligation to help you find your next job, whether it's the company or somewhere else. And so like, I think those are the things that I think about is like, how am I creating this space with my team so that they feel like they can come in and be free and as open as they want. And there's also this level of cognitive safety that exists where they don't feel like they need to like all of a sudden shirk behind something because it's a difficult conversation or the case may be. But like and my job is my hobby, to be quite honest. So like a lot of things I associate with that is like, man, how am I operating with the space that are sort of with people who trust me, not only with their day-to-day life, but honestly with their career. Because as a leader, like you're being trusted with someone's like economic prosperity.
And so what comes to mind for me are a handful of words and then a hopeful job title for me one day. The words that come up are love of self and love of others. Tim, what you brought up, trust is huge. Yeah. To give trust in order to earn trust. And it's cyclical and it's in relationship. I think humility, creativity, and courage also come up for me. And I think, so this is my job title that I've wanted for years, and sometime maybe it'll happen, but I want to be a catalyst for awesome. And that means a catalyst to bring out the awesome that exists in every human.
Yes.
And prior to this current form of David, I was a shop teacher for 16 years, teaching metal shop. And that is all about creating the container to help folks take something that's in their mind, leveraging tools, how to use them in a context to then manifest their magic and the magic of their ideas, right? And so I think about that as a catalyst for awesome, as a catalyst for folks to see themselves as designers for equity, to give them tools, show them how to use them so they can also break the rules and use them how they see fit for their context, and then design the context where they do trust me, they trust each other, and that it's a safe and brave place to experiment and make mistakes.
Yeah.
Particularly for those where historically has not been safe to make mistakes.
Yes. Yeah, actually, really quick anecdote. So my team just went through a pretty major reorg. And so like I made a decision to take on a new space. And part of that was there was a woman who she was my employee for about 6 months when I was at Microsoft, and I left Microsoft. And I convinced her to come to Facebook. And so she had to trust me to come over because she'd been at Microsoft forever. And she was like, I know this, like, I'm not growing, but I know this place. I'm happy with the space I'm in. Like, I know these things. But when the reorg happened, she sort of had the choice to come to my team, my new team, or stay where she is with the new manager. But she was in a space where she was uncomfortable, so on and so forth. And she made the decision to stay on that team because she was like, something you talked to me about is like being uncomfortable and like leaning into that and saying like, okay, I can use this to learn from, like, I think I need this to learn from it. And so it's that piece of trust was like, she trusted me to come to this company, but then she worked on trusting herself enough to stay where she was uncomfortable to be able to continue to grow and develop. And like, that was probably like, and this happened just last week. And like, that was like the best thing for me. Cause I'm like, I can't even be upset with you because I want you on my team, but I also know like, this is exactly what you should be doing. Like, this is all I preach all the time is like, just like trust yourself to do it and it'll be awesome. But yeah, like trust 100%.
And how do we design for trust? What are all the signals that folks receive that said that this space is trustworthy, that this place I can trust with my dignity? How cool of an exercise would that be to design for trust?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I would say a colleague of mine here in St. Louis, she's an architect, a Black woman, an architect, which is rare, unfortunately. Like, it is actually really disappointing when you look at the numbers in architecture and how many are people of color, and particularly how many are Black women. But she talks a lot around the idea of building at the speed of trust and really understanding that it's not something that is led through agendas. It is not something that is timed, but it is something that is organic. And when I think about liberation and how to design liberation, words that come to mind for me are like vulnerability. Also, as I stated, like legacy, love, trust. But then I also think about laughter. You know, I think about joy. And I was on a documentary that was on Hulu called Design for All that Target and Radical Media did. And one of the things, which I'm gonna be honest, I didn't remember saying this until I watched the documentary back, but I talked about how design equals possibility and joy. And I think that's where we need to really think about, like, what does it look like to have not only this sense of possibility, which I believe design lives in, but also the space of joy. But we then add that added component of joy for whom, right? And possibility for whom, because what tends to happen is that design has been possibility and joy for certain identities, but have not been for many others. And how do we challenge that? And so I want to end us on one final question, and it's a short question. And so it's
you
tied.
You know we long-winded.
I know, but it ties to what you said earlier, Tim, around what you were designing for. I want you to think about Tim that has figured out what liberation means for you, and David that has figured out what liberation means for you. That form of Tim, that form of David, what are you designing for?
Okay, my immediate reaction is going to be, I don't know. I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to figure out how I can explain it in a short way.
Which I know isn't your skill set.
It is not. Honestly, I'm designing for me, but when I say design for me, it's like every version of me that has not met or achieved or experienced that liberation. And I mean that in the sense that I think this is something I learned through the fellowship every year we've done it, is while everyone is very different, there's these common themes and stories that come through that I see myself in every single one of these individuals. We are now at 35 people so far that we've had come through the fellowship. And there is a version of me in every single one of them, or my story. And it's not meant to be like, well, when I create, as long as I think about me, I'm thinking about them, but more so I see there's a commonality. There's this thread around micro or macro traumas, around a lack of access or mentorship or growth or development. There's this dearth of things that feels like a collection over time that eats at your spirit, and at your focus on what can I be in the future if I'm not good enough right now. And I'm creating for that person. I'm tearing up. Oh shoot. I'm also sometimes a crier, but yeah, I think about that part of me, because I think that's been the hardest thing in my life to work through, And I know that's a tough part for every other Black and brown person especially in our industry. So that's what I think about.
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna go on mute so I can cry alone.
Thank you, Phil.
I think I'm first imagining liberation or liberated future. And I just watched the documentary called My Octopus Teacher. It's really fantastic. And it's about this octopus. And what I learned from it is that octopi, 2/3 of their body are their they use for total cognition. And, we by design have been reduced to this tiny portion of the left hemisphere of our brain. And so what if we designed context that allowed us to get to know 2/3 of our entire being, right? So Tim, you mentioned ultimately you're designing for your own liberation. And I think of that as well, that I feel that I am a survivor of schools and education. And I know also why I've survived is because of legacy privilege that has allowed me to survive. And how then can, how, as I'm designing my own liberation, can I design experiences for others so that they can start to feel liberated from the confines of the myth of white dominant culture?
Yeah.
So that they can see themselves as creative, kind, community-oriented, full of self-love and gratitude, vulnerability. So that, like, if we're all octopi, we almost then start looking like a rhizome, and we're all connected in some way, knowing that I don't know whose quote this is, but that our liberation is tied up in the liberation of others.
Yeah.
Perfectly said. Let's take out perfect. Greatly said. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with me today. How will people find you? How can they connect with you?
Mine is really easy. It sounds pretentious, but it's actually really true. Like Googling my last name or just my name in general, I'll be the first thing that pops up that whole page, just because like only other person that's at Timothy Bard Levins is my father, and he doesn't have a digital presence, at least as far as I know. So yeah, so like Googling me, you'll find my Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Well, not Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, LinkedIn. Facebook is for a whole other crowd of people.
We're not invited.
I mean, I'll question, do I know you? But yeah, outside of that, I will plug, of course, again, And Designs, and anddesign.co. We're doing a ton of great work. And so please follow us as well. We need to do more social media investment and whatnot. But Antionette and I have like 17 different jobs, but we're trying our best. But if anybody wants to volunteer who's listening here, we'll take a social media volunteer.
Exactly.
But yeah, that's everything.
All right, David.
My Twitter and Instagram handle is @DesignSchoolX, and I can also be found on LinkedIn at David H. Clifford. You need the H because David Cliffords are almost a dime a dozen.
So literally the opposite of spectrum. You're so far. All right. And for me, you can find me, pretty much Google me. My name literally is Antionette Carroll. On Instagram is A Carroll Design. On Twitter and LinkedIn, similar thing, Antionette, but make sure it's the I before the O, because that ain't me if it's the O before the I. So thank you both again for taking the time, and talk to you more soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. As always, you know where to find the show and all that stuff that just doesn't seem relevant on an episode like this. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode from Antionette, and looking forward to talking to you then. And as always, stay crazy.